Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, December 27th. And right before we started recording, you just mentioned to me about some Azerbaijan airline that went down. And actually, I'm not familiar with this, so I stopped you, and maybe you can fill me in on
Oh,
this and we'll go from there.
yeah, it was a couple days ago, a flight from Azerbaijan to Grozny in Russia. Yeah, and it was an Azerbaijan airliner. It was diverted from Grozny, I think, actually, because there had been drone activity there. Ukrainian drone activity, and the airport had been shut down. It was also fogged in. So the plane, I think, kind of circled around and decided to head off to an airport in Kazakhstan. And before it got there, it suffered some kind of damage. The initial report was that it had struck a bird. It crash landed, and I think out of maybe it was 77 on board, 29 survived. The others perished. Um, there were rumors that started, pretty early, as a result of some photos that had taken, I think, of the tail section, that it looked like it had been struck by a missile. And the interpretation, I'm not qualified to look at a picture and tell you, what happened to a plane, but the interpretation by some of these analysts or amateurs out there on the web said that it looked like it was an anti-aircraft, not an air defense missile. Because actually, an air defense missile will explode close to the target and send a spray of shrapnel, and that's what it looked like. Um, there wasn't any. I think there still hasn't been any statement from the Russian government other than they need to investigate. But just recently, actually, I saw a report, like 15 minutes ago, that the airline itself had determined that the crash had been caused by external mechanical and technical damage, which I guess means that some sort of foreign objects struck the plane. It wasn't because of an explosion within the plane. So still preliminary, but it sounds like this what may have happened is that these air defense systems were on high alert because of the drone activity, and when it was a tragic accident. Obviously there was no intent to bring down the plane, but we don't know. That's just speculation at this point.
hmm Well, you said that it was close to Kazakhstan, right? That was being
Yeah, I
diverted
don't. You know
there.
what? I'm not sure exactly where it was struck. If indeed it was struck, it was headed towards Kazakhstan, and I believe it crash landed in Kazakhstan. That's my understanding.
Yeah, that's a long ways from Ukraine. So I mean, you don't think that it
Yeah,
could be a Ukrainian missile, right? If it's all the way out there, it would have
yeah,
to be
right.
a Russian, friendly fire incident, which we know happens. These things do
Yeah, they
happen.
say they do happen. There was a tragedy in Iran a couple of years ago. It was actually a Ukrainian airliner that was brought down by a Iranian air defense missile, and I think everybody on board perished.
Hmm.
So yeah, these things do happen, and they're obviously tragedies, and you you want to hope it doesn't happen again, but it probably will.
Right. Well, you know that attack that happened on Kazan, where they flew a
Yeah,
drone into a high-rise building. This was something that the Ukrainians did. Kazan is a long ways away from Ukraine. How do you think they did that? Do you think that was
yeah,
launched from within inside Russia or one of these, post-Soviet satellites
uh-huh.
countries?
Yeah. It's according to the Ukrainians themselves, the drone has a range of 1,000 kilometers, but Kazan is even farther away. It should be outside the range of their long range drones. Um, so there are people have been speculating. Anonymous analysts out there on the web have been speculating that there are two possibilities. And one is that it was launched within the Russian Federation. It was like the SBU got smuggled a team into Russian territory and assembled the parts. I don't think you can walk over the border with with a drone. You have to bring it apart in pieces, and they assembled it there and then launched it. And that's a possibility. I think there's no question they've done that or similar things in the past. The other possibility was that it was launched from Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan is, it's a pretty good distance from Kazan, but it's less than 1,000 kilometers. So that may have happened. And, that would help to explain how it got through air defenses. Because if it had been launched from Ukraine, it would have to pass through a belt of pretty, dense air defense. And it seems like it's not impossible to get through, of course, but it doesn't seem likely. So it's probably one of those other two explanations.
Do you think it was their intention to hit a residential high-rise building?
Yeah, there's no question about it. Because I think there were like 5 or 6 drones that actually struck Kazan, and all but one of them hit residential towers. So they were clearly homing in on these.
Right. So this is just a terrorist attack. I don't think you described it as anything else, right? So,
Exactly.
So what's the terrorist attacks? These types of things, they're born out of desperation, you said. So, but is there some type of objective? Is it to get a response from
Yeah,
Putin
I think that's what, when people reason it through, and maybe that's something that well, you can say one of two things. Yeah, it's in order to provoke, let's say, an overreaction of some kind that would be that could again engender sympathy for Ukrainians, or ideally, this is obviously their intention, their hope. It could bring in direct participation by the Western powers. So that's one thing. And then the other is that it's supposed to, which is something that the Ukrainian officials themselves have said on previous occasions, it's supposed to bring the war home to the Russians, make them suffer, and then thereby, maybe reduce Russian morale and support for the war. And maybe the citizens of Russia will then start to pressure the government to stop the war. And you hear that again from time to time. That's the logic, but I think it's just kind of a thin overlay of logic, maybe something there. I think like much terrorism, it is born of desperation and frustration. It's just sort of a lashing out. It really doesn't accomplish anything. I think maybe that a lot of them know that, but at least say, we can kill some Russians and cause them to suffer a bit as we go down.
When something like this happens, does the West at least acknowledge that this was a terrorist attack, or that this was something, or do they just not say anything? Flying, these are big drones. They're basically mini planes.
Right.
That are flying to the U.S., we went through 9/11. Obviously, we're talking about something on a much larger scale, but you watch these little planes fly into high-rise buildings. It should bring back memories of the worst terrorist attack that ever happened in the United States.
Yeah, I think many people said that was the intention. It does. You look at it, it kind of does have the feel of 9/11. I think it does. The images are strikingly similar, and that was probably intended. So, another thing is, we'll just go to your question. What was your question? I'm sorry.
I was just saying, is there condemnation coming out from the West?
Exactly. I'm sorry. No. Very, very little. It's just what I've seen. Actually, it's like when the Western governments don't go out of the way, don't make a point of condemning these things when they're generally when presidential spokesmen or high-ranking officials are pressed by journalists, to express an opinion. They generally say, "Oh, we don't approve of something like this," because it is a clearly established norm of war. There clearly is terrorism, and so they can't say that they're in favor of it. But just below the surface, the leading opinion, let's say, centers of the New York Times or whatever, you find a lot of statements made within these media outlets that actually support the action. So I think, there is kind of an attempt to maintain a veneer of support for the norms of war, but it's not really very sincere. And I think a lot of them are cheering it on, but just it's surreptitiously.
How do they justify the support for an action like that? Like the
Well,
Washington
for the
Times.
reasons that I gave earlier, like it brings the war home to I know that at least that's that argument has appeared in Western media outlets, echoing again the Ukrainians. But that's an argument for terrorism. That's what that is. Let's be honest.
Right. Okay, well, we're talking about some of these mysteries, this mystery airliner. There's another mystery as well, and you just mentioned it to me before the podcast, and I was reading about it, is this Russian vessel called Ursa Major. It sank on Monday. The Russians said that this was a terrorist attack, sabotage, that brought the ship down. And then it got a little bit even iffier. Russian sailors were on a lifeboat, apparently, and a Norwegian vessel was in the area. And there's distress signals, but the Norwegian boat refused to let the people on the lifeboat onto the vessel, because they put the blame on, said that, oh, well, the Spanish maritime officials are sending a rescue vessel, so we're not supposed to intervene. But Russia is clearly very upset, saying this is a breach of international maritime law, a distress ship. I mean, even in times of war, when you're openly on war, if there's people in the water in a lifeboat, even if they're the enemy, you take them on. You can take them as prisoners, but you bring them on your ship. So this is causing a bit of a stir. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think, first, what happened to the ship? And why did they not bring the sailors on board?
Right. Well, okay, yeah. First of all, I think it was the captain or the of the ship that made that statement that it was a suspected terrorist blast. I think obviously he can't determine that outright. Apparently there wasn't any that they were aware of any kind of mechanical failure or whatever that would explain it. And so they strongly suspect, and they're probably right, that bombs were planted on the ship. Now, about this whole incident, it was initially the Norwegian ship, just said that they had to respect some kind of prohibition, and they didn't explain it. And obviously the Russians, for very good reason, were very upset. Now, they were picked up by some Spanish ships shortly thereafter, and I don't think their lives were ever in danger. And then the Norwegians provided a fuller explanation, and which was the one that you gave, that they had been instructed by the Spanish Maritime Authority to wait because Spain had already sent these ships to pick them up, and apparently there was, the sea was calm, they weren't in any danger. So it may have been, actually done something that was done according to the book. Again, it's just that information came out very, very recently, and it came out after the Russian government had, expressed its anger. So, maybe that changes their understanding of the situation.
Mm-hmm. So you think that it's probable that it was terrorism, that if this was something that the Ukrainians are planning bombs on Russian ships, like you really think that's what might have happened?
I certainly think it could have happened. Yeah, that would be, it was a ship, I think, that was going from St. Petersburg. So it must have gone through the Strait of Gibraltar. It was heading towards the Suez Canal on its way to Vladivostok, and it had some rather, actually valuable specialized port equipment. I think that was a cargo that was really quite valuable. I don't know if that was targeted for that reason by the Ukrainians, but I find it believable that they could have done something like that. Now, how they did it, I don't know. Maybe they, it seems unlikely that they got into the ship, as it was being loaded. But I suppose that's not impossible. They have, and the other possibility is that something like had been attached to the ship. Or maybe there was even a I think less likely, a submersible or surface drone. Yeah, I don't think they would have the ability. You would hope not. I mean, because if they launched something like that from within the Mediterranean, it would strongly suggest some sort of Western cooperation.
Mhm.
So we'll just have to, hopefully, an investigation will be done and we'll have a clearer picture of what happened. But
I
that would,
find
that would be kind of a major, you say success, not a major success. Yeah, it's obviously not going to affect the course of the war in any meaningful way, but it would be a blow against. It is a blow against Russian industry, Russian commerce.
Okay, well, I know you don't love to speculate, but I'm going to keep this speculation train going to a third mystery, which is that there was an underwater cable between Estonia and Finland that was cut.
Right,
And from my understanding, Finland has seized a Russian oil tanker and has accused this Russian oil tanker of cutting this line.
right.
So, what are your thoughts on this? Who do you think did this?
I
What's going on?
Yeah, I really don't know. It's they claim that the Russian tanker was right over the cable at the time that the cable was cut. Now there have been previous incidents that has to be pointed out. I think like two or three previous incidents of other cables in the same area, and they actually didn't accuse the Russians of being involved in those apparent sabotage events. In fact, they accused a Chinese ship, and they wanted to board it. The Chinese refused. I think maybe they were long gone or something. But yeah, this time they've accused the Russians, and they boarded the ship. And we'll see. It's I think it was an electrical cable. I mean, it supplied electric power to Estonia from Finland. The other ones were communications cables. And honestly, I just don't know what's going on. I really don't.
Right. But this isn't normal. Clearly these things are
Yeah.
tied to the conflict in some way, right? I mean, it's not normal. You said there was two other cables that were cut. I mean, obviously the Nord Stream, I think everybody knows, is the US that did this, but these types of things, underwater cables being cut, is not a normal occurrence, right?
Right.
I mean,
It could happen theoretically anyway, like an anchor is dropped and it
right.
and then
But you said
drags
there's
along the batten.
three incidents now, all in the same
Yeah, at least,
area?
right. Yeah, so that does seem like there's something afoot, and I don't know. I mean, it's not impossible that the Russians are engaged in some sabotage. These are very, very hostile countries. All of them, the Baltic states and Finland are among the most hostile to them. But I honestly don't. If it's the Russians, it just seems to me, I can't really see the point to it.
Right, doesn't
other
seem
than
like their MO.
Yeah.
These Finland and Estonia aren't actual threats to Russia, and I don't think they would try to risk something like that. Something so
Yeah.
provocative.
Well,
But
I'll even
who
say,
knows?
I don't know, but a false flag is possible. It just seems like, again, like the Russophobia in this part of Europe is so extreme that anything to just, these are countries where you find it's ridiculous, of course, because they're very small countries, but they seem to want to go to war with Russia, and maybe there are groups within, especially the intelligence communities there or whatever, that would just do anything to raise the temperature of the population, to create a war fever. So I don't know that that's the case. That doesn't seem likely, but I can't really think of any likely explanation. I'll just be honest with you. It just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know what's going on.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it just feels like we have an increased amount of activity in terms of terrorist activity. I mean, we have
Yeah, well, there's no
the strike
question
on
that,
Kazan,
right.
the assassination of Igor Kirillov, this plane that went down, this Russian ship that was sunk, this cable that was cut. These all happened in a span of, like 10 days?
Right. And not
since
only that, there's been a rash of kind of minor terrorist incidents within Russia. Apparently, what's been happening is that the Ukrainians, they'll scam Russian citizens, scam of their money, and then they'll come to them and say, "Well, we'll give you the money back if you do this, like you set fire to a bank or something." And and some of these Russians actually do it, and they've been caught and they've confessed, and I think like a dozen of these incidents have occurred in the last, let's say, week or two. And then, recently I think there was some more serious assassination plots or terrorist plots that were foiled by the FSB just recently. There does seem to be an uptick in terrorist activity within Russia. Yeah, no doubt about it.
And do you think this is just because things are so dire currently in Ukraine, or does this have something to do with the fact that Trump is coming soon and they feel like they only have, like 25 days to get everything done to prove to the West and NATO to make World War III happen? Is that the...
Yeah, it's all those possibilities. So, again, I would say it's something that they like to do, too. I mean, I think that can't be, we want to kind of impose this really cold, calculated rationality on it, but I don't even know how rational it is. It is I think it is in general just a sign of desperation. It's a lashing out. It's not gonna help help their military effort in any significant way. It just can't.
Okay. You mentioned also right before this, we started recording, that there is a potential major offensive. When you're talking about a potential major offensive, you're talking about, this is what's so crazy, is I don't know if you're talking about the Russians or the Ukrainians, because of course there's no way you think that the Ukrainians are clearly on the back foot, that an offensive would be a terrible decision. But they did Kursk, and we've seen things like historically Battle of the Bulge, this type of thing, the Ardennes offensive. Mm-hmm. So what just tell me about your thoughts on this, what you've heard, and what type of offensive you see coming.
Yeah, well, there's actually been talk about a potential Russian offensive in the Zaporozhye region, in southern Donbass. No, it's not Donbass, I'm sorry, southern Ukraine. And just about a week ago, there was an intensive artillery barrage of positions on the Ukrainian side of the Dnieper in Kherson city, and there was some talk. It has since died away that maybe the Russians were planning some kind of river crossing there to retake Kherson. But all along there's been talk, actually going back a couple of months, maybe 3 months or more, of a possible offensive in Zaporozhye. And the reason is that it's just that area, Kherson and Zaporozhye, which of course are right next to each other. There are a lot of Russian brigades there. There are 130,000 fully trained Russian soldiers, led by an experienced general. So people were wondering, what are they doing there? And then also, I guess if you look at the if you look at the front lines there, they're pretty weak. They're not very well manned. The Ukrainians have pulled off a lot of their soldiers from that area, to and sent them to places like Kursk, of course, which is a fool's errand, but also to the southern Donbass, where so much of the fighting has been taking place. So it seems like it's a vulnerable part of the line. And it's also, Zaporozhye is one of the regions that Putin has made clear is Russian territory. So eventually it's something that they want to take. And I think it would make military sense. I've made this argument, I think, at least a couple of weeks ago, that it would really make sense for them to launch an offensive before Trump comes into office. Because if they can really collapse the Ukrainian line in one place and just achieve a really clear breakthrough before he comes into office, that'll make things easier for him to walk away from Ukraine. Because if it's clear that even to the most misled American consumer of news that the Russians are have the clear advantage of winning the war, and they understand that before he comes to office, then it's harder to blame Ukraine's defeat on Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So there is that, but and then also it is a region that they've said that it belongs to them, and clearly they're going to take, and it looks like it's also not very well fortified. The line is brittle there; it's not very well manned, and then behind them there's just not much. It's sort of like what we're seeing also in the southern Donbass. Is they're going through the last of the fortifications.
Well, when you say Trump will just walk away, does that mean that there will be negotiations being entered into, or that simply Trump is just going to say, no more money, no more arms, Europe, this is your problem. You guys figure it out and we're out.
Yeah, the latter. I mean, he's made those statements. Of course, he's made all kinds of statements. But I think there's actually would be quite a bit of support. We've seen it in the past, in past votes taken within the Congress, quite a bit of support among the Republicans for significantly reducing aid to Ukraine, or maybe even just cutting off aid to Ukraine. Now, the problem is, of course, that if you have this narrative firmly established, like, okay, the Ukrainians can win this, they just need, a few more tanks or a few more missiles, or and then you cut off aid, the line collapses, the Russians march to the Dnieper, then it's the blame game begins, and it will be easy for the Democrats to say, look, essentially the Republicans are stooges of Putin. They've helped him take this territory, and they don't want to do that. So that's going to constrain them. They don't want to be involved in this, but they don't want to be blamed for pulling out either. So if the Russians can achieve something major, it would make it easier. Even then it might not be possible, but it would make it easier. Just say that, okay, look, they clearly are losing. They can't win this war. What are we doing? But if things remain as they are, though, anybody who really is looking at, I think, at the situation objectively and thoroughly will understand that the Russians are winning, will win, but nobody in the U.S. is doing that, or hardly anyone. Again, the map is changing in favor of the Russians, but it's incremental still. And you still get these stories that say, well, okay, yeah, the Ukrainians are somewhat on the back foot there, but the Russians are suffering these horrific losses, and and their economy is about to collapse. So if we just hang in a little bit longer, the things will change. But I think if you see a march to the Dnieper, it'll just be harder to give the war that kind of spin.
So if the Americans pull out, Trump just says, we're out of here, then what happens? Does Ukraine just instantly collapse? I mean, who goes to the negotiating table? Well, what happens to Ukraine?
Right. Well, I think that's pretty much true. And the Ukrainians themselves have said they really can't last more than a couple of weeks, maybe at the most a couple of months.
Because we're funding the government. It's not just that we're giving them military aid. Right. It's their whole government is being supported by U.S. taxpayer dollars.
Right. Yeah. The U.S. and Europe, of course.
Right.
But the U.S. is especially the major supplier of weapons. I think Europe plays perhaps a larger role in funding the government, but we play a major role. If we really pulled out entirely. Now, a lot of these things, like commitments, were made previously, and you don't pull out of them. Even if you make a decision that we're not going to send any more money, some of that money is going to continue to flow for a while, according to previous commitments. But I think you would see the results pretty soon on the front line, and it would obviously be a huge blow to morale, which is already seems to be very, very low on the Ukrainian side. But they still have to think, well, we got, the Americans that are back. So just hang in there, they'll get us out of it. And then it becomes clear, oh no, the Americans are leaving. It's harder to convince yourself that you have any chance for a victory.
What will this do to Europe? What this whole thing comes down? I mean, if Ukraine loses, is this something that Europeans should be afraid of? Or is it something that, they should actually be happy about, saying, okay, first of all, we stop the killing. People will stop dying. But then there's a possibility of maybe slowly normalizing relationships with Russia to bring the energy back in, to get the industry going, to kickstart the economy. Because right now, Europe is this sinking ship, and every single prime minister or president, chancellor of all these countries, they're just all a bunch of little kids screaming with their, the house is on fire, not doing anything. They're just running around panicking
Yeah.
And nobody's getting anything done. It's just they're just watching the whole thing burn, and they just scream instead of trying to put out the fire.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, we've talked a lot about this, but I think that's a good description. It's just like a bunch of kids running around screaming, and they're just, with the exception of Fico and Orban, there aren't any, as they say, adults in the room. These are leaders that are talking about reality and about the interests of their own people, and doing their best to to protect and enrich, their own people. They're responsible leaders, but the others are just nuts. Just to give you an example, a story came out very recently that the Prime Minister of Denmark had announced that she had purchased 3 days worth of canned goods. And she done that.
Wait,
because
3 days?
3 days. That's what I saw.
She's going on a weekend camping trip? What is this?
I thought, like, the first time, maybe I just read it wrong the first time. I thought the first time I saw it was 3 years. But then I looked at it again in 3 days, and other people commented that it's 3 days. So I don't know because it's just so silly, right? I know. But and she suggested that everybody do this, because of the possibility of a Russian attack. This is silly. Whether it's 3 years or 3 days, it's just silly. This is not going to get. This is not a solution. It's not reality. It's just hysteria. That's all it is.
Yeah, it's really astonishing. I'm sure you've heard a lot of this crazy talk coming from Trump about retaking the Panama Canal, making Canada the 51st state, and also taking Greenland, buying it, or even potentially just taking it. First of all, these are very colonial type of language coming out. We got to retake Panama, fit for Denmark, but they're always blaming Russia being this imperialist colonial power of them taking it. But can anybody point to anything that Putin has said saying that he's going to take Denmark, where we have Trump saying we're going to just take Greenland, which is owned by Denmark,
right?
That we're going to take it, and she's like, we better stock up on canned goods because these Russians.
Right.
It's just putting like if Putin ever said anything like that, like what Trump just said in the past week about Panama, Canada, and Greenland, the West would lose its mind and just say, look at all this proof of Putin's intentions to conquer the world. They want to create become the world hegemon. We have to stop them. And Trump's just tweeting, maybe we take Greenland. We got to get Panama back, and
make Canada the 51st state.
Right. So I don't know. What do you think about that? Him making those statements and just
that's pretty
juxtaposing
wild.
To Putin.
Yeah. Well, I think you're the contrast that you've drawn is fair and should be made, and just. It is really wild talk on the part of, it's not what a U.S. president should be saying. It really isn't. I think it's kind of funny. It's entertaining, and I'm sure nothing will come of it. But it's not the way, a statesman talks. Let's just put it that way.
Right. I mean, we had people like Lindsey Graham just openly saying like, oh, well, Ukraine's sitting on trillions of dollars worth of natural resources, and we got to take that. We can't let Russia and China get it because that's how they view the world. And Trump making statements like this kind of makes me think that he's thinking in similar way of Lindsey Graham, that we have to, Greenland's got all these resources and we just have to take it. And then it's this old fashioned colonial mindset game that they have.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, the thing is, Trump is not a neocon. The neocons are about ideology, about exporting the revolution to the rest of the world. But that's not. He's not interested in that. Yeah, he is just sort of an old-fashioned colonialist. So when he did attempt at one point to pull out of Syria, but then he also said, "Hey, we're getting the oil." It was just like that's the way he looks at things. If we can just as kind of as a crude business transaction. And that's not the way you're supposed to talk. I mean, I think clearly in the end, the ideologues, even though they use very, or maybe because they use very idealistic language, um, end up doing a lot more damage. They end up killing a lot more people than somebody like Trump and his crude acquisitiveness, we'll just say.
Hmm. Right. I think you said something to me earlier that made a lot of sense. Is that, maybe the way that Trump is talking, it's immoral. The idea of going in and taking resources, but at least there is some rationality behind it. You can understand that at least there's some rational acting going on. But with these ideologues, it's like we start these wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, and we're not even taking anything. We just kill people, destroy the country, and
Right.
spend tons of money. We go massively
Right.
into debt, and then we're like, "Well, job well done. We're out of here."
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense.
Or we just memory hole it and go
Right.
on to the next
Which
disaster. That's what often happens. And it's all done for for the noblest of reasons. That's always how, it's always cloaked in that kind of thing. It's about human rights. Okay, I guess you would say like the people that emphasize human rights are not exactly neocons. There's a huge overlap between these different interventionists. But with the right to protect people, like Samantha Powers. Um, with the neocons, it's about markets and democracy. It's and gay pride parades. That's what it is. So we're doing it because these are our ideals, these are our values, and that's what everyone in the world wants to have. They're all eager to become little Americans. We quite openly had talk like that about Iraq, and we actually pretty quickly figured out. I'm trying to remember the name of him. His first name is Peter, but I think he ended up. Well, anyway, he was part of the occupation of Iraq, and he was been assigned to actually administer a region. And he said, well, now we're going to introduce this. It's going to be feminism and that and the other things, all those good things that that we believe in. And he said that, frankly, he found out, after a year of trying these different things, that the Iraqis were not interested in becoming little Americans. They just weren't, and they really resented the efforts. But anyway, kind of straying a little bit. It is the neocons again are ideological, and they're very closely allied to the right to protect people, who are also ideological. But both of these people have caused the deaths. Both of these groups have caused the deaths of millions of people, have just entirely destroyed countries. And Trump is crude, and I think he's wrong. I find it embarrassing when he talks like that, and it's it's not, but in the end, it's that kind of thinking. Well, first of all, I don't think it's going to have any real effect, and to the extent that it does, it's probably going to be more limited. It's just about this oil field or that. It's not this global crusade to overthrow regimes everywhere.
It's also just easier to see through. Right.
I was going to make that point too. It's actually it's very crudeness. It makes it less dangerous. You can see what it is, but people get fooled by the other talk. And that's what makes it so dangerous.
It's disguised under this whole human rights veil. Like, well, we got to help people. We got to protect them. Oops, we killed millions.
Yeah.
But, our intentions were good.
Our intentions are always noble. And then we go on to the next disaster, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me switch over to the Middle East a little bit. So, let me
started off with Sabotage. I'll just say this real quickly. It's, because you have 130,000. I was talking about, this is not anything that anybody else has said. It just seems to me that it makes sense to do this before Trump takes office. But there is this question whether they go for Kherson or they go for Zaporozhye. And looking at it, logic, you say, well, Zaporozhye is much easier. You don't have to cross a river. River crossing is very difficult. And I think that's probably right. It's almost certainly going to be Zaporozhye. But then, I thought about D-Day, and actually almost everybody believed it was going to happen at Calais. They wouldn't be crazy enough to do it at Normandy. where you have these cliffs. And that really was a challenge, and they overcame it. But sometimes an army will make a choice to actually to strike the stronger point because that's the point of attack that's not expected by the enemy. The enemy may be sure, they're just not going to try this, and they just move all their forces over to Zaporozhye or whatever, and then just leave Kherson completely undefended. So it's not impossible. I think if they make this move, and there are a lot of rumors that it's imminent. We've heard rumors like that in the past that prove false, but sometimes they prove to be true. I think it would be better than 90% that it'll be Zaporozhye rather than Kherson.
Okay, well, I think we'll see. I mean, I think, I don't think it can last much longer. And once it starts to unravel, I think the news is going to come in real fast. Lots of things are going to start to happen all at once. So we'll keep a close eye on it. But moving over to the Middle East, I'm going to start you off with something pretty big in general. Is just what's the deal with the Kurds? I don't know much about Kurds, but I know that they are there in Syria, and Erdogan doesn't like them. And then I was hearing something about Israel working with them. So can you just tell me a little bit about the Kurds, and then we'll move from there?
Yeah. Okay. Well, they are a distinct ethnicity, and you find them in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And you can see that when the Western powers split up the Ottoman Empire, they obviously, they simply drew lines in the sand, we'll say, and it wasn't to the benefit of the Kurds. The Kurds found themselves in these 4 different countries. And so they've always had this, I think quite understandably, have had this nationalist aspiration. They want a Kurdistan, a country for themselves. But also understandably, the countries that in which they find themselves, whether it's Iran, Iraq, Turkey, or Syria, have always fought these aspirations. In Turkey, it was actually quite violent. There was a civil war, not quite a civil war, but an ongoing terrorist insurrection in eastern Turkey, and it went on for a long time. I don't think it's actually entirely stopped. Occasionally, you hear about a terrorist incident, but I remember back, let's say in the 1980s, that whenever Turkey made it into the news, it was actually because of fighting or some sort of major terrorist attack carried out by the Kurds in eastern Turkey. So they were a real threat, a real headache for the Turks for a long time. And, they still, I guess, propose some kind of threat, as a potential threat. And it's for that reason that Erdogan and the Turkish government in general is not happy about an independent Kurdish force right on their border. And that's what they have in Syria. And I think to some extent, too, in Iraq. I don't know exactly. It's hard to get information about what's really going on in northwestern Iraq. But there has been sort of if you actually look at Wikipedia or any sort of official source, it describes this Kurdish region in northwestern Iraq as semi-autonomous. But I think it's really more than that. It goes way back, actually during the years, the pre-9/11 years, when Iraq was under very severe economic sanctions that led to, starvation deaths of 500,000 children and an equal number of adults. And then in years had followed, that Kurdish enclave was always kept separate. It was actually, it was not subject to the sanctions. It wasn't bombed because there was a period of actually kind of regular bombing that a lot of people have forgotten about that went on for years and years. It's just that pretty much the Western powers, the U.S. in particular, just declared that they owned Iraqi airspace and they've just felt free to strike different targets within Iraq. But again, this Kurdish enclave was excluded. So, and then to this day, though it's described as semi-autonomous, it was reported that the Israelis actually launched their attack on Iran over that part of Iraq, which tells you that they have a great deal of influence there. And I remember there was some sort of Iranian attack. I really can't remember exactly when it was, but it on Israeli targets, and one of them was right there. So there was some sort of Israeli intelligence center, and I'm sure there are probably several there. So the Israelis have worked closely with them. The Americans work closely there. It's technically Iraqi territory, but it seems like it's maybe only Iraqi territory in name. And then you find something similar, very similar, of course, in eastern Syria. The Americans have been there for a long time, and their occupation of that land contributed greatly to the fall of the Assad government, because that's where the Syrian oil is, or the vast majority of it, and where their best agricultural lands were. And they deprived, this country that was already quite poor of these very necessary resources by occupying that land. And they continue to occupy it. And everybody knows, too, that the Israelis are involved there. Again, I don't think they have any military forces, but probably intelligence advisors. They see both of these pieces of land as important to their ongoing sort of attack or war on Iran. It's through that, again, through these territories, that they're able to actually approach the Iranian border, because that Kurdish territory in northwestern Iraq has a border with Iran.
Interesting. So is the reason that the United States and Israel are working with the Kurds and supporting the Kurds is because they're promising them that, hey, after this is all said and done, whatever it is, a wider regional war, carving up Syria, that we'll be able to make you your own Kurdistan. And so the Kurds, they have these national aspirations, like you said, right. That's one of the most important things for them. So they say, yeah, okay, well, we'll make a deal with the devil, or maybe they don't even view it that way. They say these are our allies. Israel and the U.S. will help, overthrow these other regional powers, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and then we can make our own state. Is that the thinking behind it?
Well, I'm sure that the Americans haven't stated that openly. They wouldn't, because they know that would raise alarm bells, certainly with Erdogan, and they don't want to do that. Again, never forget, Turkey is a member of NATO. But they probably have led let's put it this way, they simply kind of allowed the Kurds to believe that maybe, that will be the end result of their partnership. But I'm sure they haven't stated that explicitly, openly. They couldn't, that would, again, create some very severe diplomatic problems if they did, again, with Iraq, and with Turkey. Of course, they never cared about Syria or Iran. And then Iran, I would just say that Iran has a number of minority groups, and the Kurds are one of them. And I think there's no question, like, the Israelis have tried to work with them, because they do whatever they can to subvert, Iranian government authority. But I don't think they've had a whole lot of success with the Kurds. I may be wrong, but when you hear about these attacks or terrorist incidents, and I can't recall one that involved Kurds. So there probably have been some. I just can't recall any. More often it's Baluchistan, or the Baluchis, which are another minority within Iran.
Baluchis? Are they from Italy? What's going on here?
No, I don't know anything about them. I'll be honest with you. Don't know anything about them. But the Americans and the Israelis are always looking at some way, some sort of weakness and some chink in the Iranian armor. And you always look, as they have, and as they did in Syria, you look to minority groups that maybe have resentments or have nationalist aspirations, and you work with them, and that is a way of weakening central government power.
Just when I thought I was kind of understanding the region, and then the Syria thing happened, and I just realized, like, man, I just know nothing about this area. You just brought up Baluchis. Now we got Kurds.
It's a fascinating area. It's the cradle of civilization for the world. And these are the Mesopotamia and eastern Turkey, northern Syria. This is where the earliest cities arose.
Hmm.
And it's quite a so it has a very, very long history, and all groups have come and gone, and empires have risen and fallen, and
Yeah, I would love to travel through there if we just weren't
yeah,
destroying the whole thing constantly.
right,
It's
yeah,
just such a
it's
shame.
actually
Like
yeah,
what an interesting place
right,
to be able to go travel around and visit. But now we have. I mean, Syria is just chaos right now. I just don't. The future's so uncertain. It just
yeah,
we know that it's just going to be bad. That
yeah,
seems to be the
right.
end result. But so anyways, is there any other reason that Israel will be working with the Kurds? Because right now, Turkey is coming in, and they seem to be intent on getting rid of the Kurds. I wonder if there's some potential flashpoint there, and also
Yeah,
just the
well,
fact that Syria used to be a buffer zone between Israel and Turkey, but now that's gone, and it
yeah,
seems pretty clear now that HTS was basically kind of extension of Erdogan, Turkey's
uh-huh,
military. Their terrorist army that they
yeah,
supported, but it seems like they're taking orders mostly from Turkey. So
right.
if Israel is moving into Syria, southern Israel, taking the Golan, moving in, and Turkey is kind of controlling Syria to some extent, pushing out the Kurds. I'm wondering, all of a sudden, you have a Turkey proxy essentially right up against Israel, and I'm just thinking, can that go badly? I mean,
It could.
obviously it
Yeah,
could, but
yeah, obviously it could. Yeah, no, there is that danger. I, again, they're the two countries have very different objectives, or maybe they're not so different. Okay, I think, first of all, the Israelis, as I've said, they've always wanted to simply wanted a weak and chaotic Syria. They didn't want a unified, strong Syria that resisted them, and their dream came true. They now have a chaotic and weak Syria, and a chaotic and weak Syria doesn't present any kind of threat to them. It severs the link between Iran and Hezbollah. Maybe not 100%. There are obviously ways to get arms and provide support to Hezbollah, but the main route, the main supply route, has been cut, and so it's going to be more difficult. Um, and then it allows them to seize territory. They can always claim, and now that there's not a real army in Syria, um, certainly not in southern Syria, they can simply seize territory that's valuable to them. And that's what they've done. And then there are, of course, groups within Israel that would actually like to go all the way to Damascus. And then Erdogan made some comment about how Damascus was once part of the Ottoman Empire, and he would like to go there. So there is a potential. I mean, there's at present they're pretty far apart. I think clearly the Israelis and the Americans, well, and the Americans kind of basically are there because of the Israelis. Let's really be honest. That there was really no reason for them to be opposed to Assad or Hezbollah or so many of these groups in the Middle East if it wasn't for Israel. Israel
right.
really has shaped our foreign policy there. Um, but Israel, I think, clearly wants to maintain its influence in eastern Syria among the Kurds there. First of all, because it is valuable flyover area, though I think now all of Syria probably is because they've taken out the air defense. So that maybe is not so important. But they want a divided Syria. They want to, as long as the Americans are still there and the Kurds are in control of those resources, Syria will remain impoverished. And I think they would like to keep it that way. I think there's no question about it. Now, Erdogan, again, he does not like this independent Kurdish force on his borders. So I don't know what's happening right now, but in the first several days after the fall of Assad, um, the his proxy army. Okay, he has different kinds of proxy armies there, and HTS is one of them. But kind of like the one that he controls most directly is called, I believe, the Syrian National Army, and it's made up of, I believe, of Turkmen. It's an ethnic group within, obviously very closely related to the Turks, if not just outright Turks, but they actually are Syrian citizens. But he has the most direct control over that army, and they were fighting the Kurds, and they've already taken some territory from them. And he's threatened to move in directly, just send the Turkish army in. I think maybe it was just yesterday, he delivered an ultimatum: either you lay down your arms or, we invade. So we may very well see a Turkish invasion of northeastern Syria, and then there is a potential for direct conflict between Turkey and the U.S.
Well, that would be crazy, right?
Yeah.
Two NATO nations, like what? They both enact Article 5?
Okay. Apparently, if the fighting takes place like in Syria, it wouldn't have to, because it wouldn't be attack on. Neither of them are on their home territory.
And neither of them are supposed to be there.
Exactly. We were an occupying force there in violation of international law. Carrying out a very cruel occupation that just, it immiserated the Syrian population. And then the Turks shouldn't be there either. So it's just something, it actually wouldn't be grounds for invoking Article 5.
What a mess. It's crazy. It just seems like everybody that's there right now, that's all the movers, none of them are supposed to be there. We got Israel, the US, Turkey, all moving in, going to carve up Syria. The only people that were supposed to be there were the Russians that were on the invitation of the Assad government.
And the Iranians.
And the Iranians. But then after the fall of it, it sounded like actually HTS, probably at the behest of Erdogan, was saying, hey, don't leave Russia. So Russia's the only one that is so supposedly like kind of being pressured a little bit to stay, but it sounds like they're leaving, right? They're like, this is a mess. We're out of here, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think they've pulled all their forces back to the bases, and both the air base and the port there, the naval base, and I think a lot of them, actually have already been sent home back to Russia. They're still there, and apparently a decision hasn't been made. But they're talking about, I think, if they remain there, it's going to be sort of a skeleton crew. They're not going to devote major resources, and kind of like a sort of thing that they can abandon at a moment's notice if things start to turn south. They clearly don't want to get, entangled in Syrian politics. I think they're going to do everything they can to prevent that.
Yeah, I mean, pulling out, I think the West might look at that as a sign of weakness and like, oh, look at these Russians, turning tail run. But if they just leave a skeleton crew, I heard something about them trying to turn it into sort of humanitarian centers or something like this, not a military function anymore. Who knows? But if they do pull out, I think that's actually a very good move. In many ways. Well, one, it doesn't get them entangled into something broader, and it's a dangerous place. If you got Turkey there, you got the U.S. there, you got Israel there. It's just not something. It's a powder keg, right? And so just move out. It doesn't seem to provide many strategic interests. I think they're moving some bases to Libya, but also I think even it's kind of the bigger thing that it does is it's kind of showing this is the multipolar way that you don't if a country invites you to be there, then sure, okay, you can go. But you don't get involved in these external conflicts. You stick at home. Like, this is a mess. We don't even know who's in charge. So let's just get out of here. That's
well, no regime change operations or anything. But in this case, it was the legitimate, government authority in Syria that requested their help, and they provided it and helped the Syrian military to turn the tide against ISIS and against Al Qaeda, it ended tragically, but it was initially quite successful.
Right, but I think it just the thinking, if you compare the Russian way and the American way.
There would be tremendous pressure just to stay there.
Right. We would never pull out. We never do. We just always try to expand, even though it's to our detriment. We're not achieving anything. We're just draining money. They're liabilities, these bases. They're just sitting ducks. And I think maybe the West is maybe kind of surprised at kind of the way that Russia behaves. I think the longer that this goes on, the world can just see these two great powers, the United States and the way it behaves, and Russia. Whatever there's any type of even a potential thought of an attack on the U.S. base that's illegally occupying a country, we'll go crazy. And then there will be terrorist attacks, planes flying into, or drones flying into high-rise buildings in Kazan. And the Russians are just like, okay, we stay calm. We're going to think this. Don't overreact. Don't invade 10 countries, because that's what the U.S. would do. And
that's of course what we did in response to 9/11. Maybe not 10 countries, but we launched two just astronomically expensive and also
just devastating.
Devastating. It shouldn't be forgotten that the Iraq War led to, I believe it was 2 million or 2.5 million refugees. 2.5 million Iraqis fled to other countries, to places like Syria, as a matter of fact, and Turkey and other countries as well. 2 million internally displaced people, and something on the order of 700,000, maybe even 1 million dead. There are studies that showed, just looking at newspaper reports, found 100,000 direct deaths in Iraq as a result of our intervention, our invasion. But as we pointed out in talking about Gaza, there's a figure of something like 45,500 now. That's almost certainly an undercount, but that's just direct deaths. Direct deaths are always just a fraction of the total deaths that result from war. So if you had 100,000 direct deaths in Iraq, it's not at all surprising that you would have 700,000 or even 1 million total deaths. It's just not, let's not forget what happened there. I think every once in a while we need to be reminded of the horror, the horrific consequences of that war. And it was response to a terrorist attack, a very, a massive one, a massively successful one, but that had nothing to do with the country that we invaded.
Yeah. It's
we know that,
crazy.
but I think it's just every once in a while, again, we need to restate this.
Right.
Because it's such a huge...
I was so young when that happened that I never fully understood it. And I don't have the same kind of perspective that you do, because I was just a little kid, and it was, when 9/11 happened, it was, I saw how everybody, even me, I was like a 5th grade, I don't remember, but we changed the menus to freedom fries and freedom toast, all these things. Everybody got super patriotic after that, and then we ended up invading countries that had nothing to do with it. But everybody got along with it. So we just have to remind ourselves of just that risk, that if there is some type of event, and I think Russia is aware of that how the U.S. spin machine, how you can get war fever, drum up your population, and then something disastrous happens. And like you said, 1 million people die, millions displaced, trillions of dollars spent. It's just such a horrific thing. And then when we're talking about a country like Russia or Iran, we're talking about, something that could be 10 times, 100 times. I mean, with Russia, we could talk about the end of the world even. Like, this isn't a game that we should play, but we act like it's a game, it seems like. But it seems like Russia does not. They seem to be very cautious and careful, and they're showing, I think, the world that they have no desire to be a global hegemon. Like, they're not trying to hold on to bases and put their pieces on a board like this. The U.S. is, and I think the U.S., we keep on trying to portray Russia as an imperialist power. And so I think maybe we're surprised that they don't react that way. Like, why aren't they falling for our traps? Because this is how we would react. And I think the world's starting to see that more and more. And it's just, I think that's just further, strengthening bricks and leading to the demise of the U.S. empire. And we're just going to, I don't know if we'll just fade off into the sunset. It sounds like we're going to go off in the sunset with a big boom. Is what kind of what's...
Yeah, that's my fear too.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we can end it there unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
No.
Okay. All right. Have a good day and a good weekend. All
okay.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye.